2.3 Living processes in multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms are organisms that consist of more than one cell. For human being, we're starting from ovule and sperm cell, and after fertilization, it will go into form the zygote, which is only one cell, and this cell will go in to divide by mitosis and forming the embryo. And this animal cell will start to undergo differentiation. Differentiation is the cell going to change shape and adapt themselves to carry out specific functions. And this process, during its development, it will form different types of cell, which is specialized to form a specific function. So here, this embryo is made up of different types of tissue already. And this cell will going to undergo specialization also. And it's a process of change and adaptation that a cell undergoes to give it spatial structure and specific function. And the embryo will continue to develop into fetus. The difference between fetus and embryo is the fetus already have the human shape. Of course, multicellular organisms are able to carry out different living processes like the respiration, nutrition, locomotion, transport, and respond to stimuli. And it involves different specialized cells, and the cell structure is very unique for the specific function. Example of the specialized cell in respiration is the epithelial cell, which cover the lining of the blood capillary and the alveolus. And the structure of this epithelial cell is thin and flattened to allow the gaseous exchange. Specialized cell in nutrition here is the epithelial cell, which cover the lining of the villus in small intestine, and the spatial structure here like the microvilli, and the cell undergoes specialization to form the goblet cell, which can secrete mucus. For locomotion, the specialized cell here is the skeletal muscle cell. And for transport, the specialized cell here is the cardiac muscle cell, which build out the wall of the heart, and the red blood cell, which transport oxygen, and the nerve cell, or we call it neuron, and it helps to respond to stimuli. During development, animal cells will undergo differentiation to become 4 different types of animal tissue, and the plant will become 2 different types of plant tissue. Please remember first the 4 different types of animal tissue: epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and nerve tissue. For the plant, meristematic tissue and permanent tissue. For the permanent tissue, divided into 3: epidermal tissue, vascular tissue, and ground tissue. After memorizing the 4 different animal tissue, we should be able to identify the example of the tissue and the specialized cell. For epithelial tissue, there are different heights, different shapes, with different function, but all of it cover the body surface, either inner surface or outer surface. One of the example of specialized cell here is the epithelial cell that cover the inner surface of small intestine. Muscle tissue. There are 3 different types of muscle tissue: smooth muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue. And the diagram here, this is the smooth muscle cell. And this is the skeletal muscle cell. We call it cell because the diagram shown here only one cell, so we cannot call it tissue. Connective tissue. There are 6 different connective tissue. Loose connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, bone, blood, and adipose tissue. And this is the 2 examples of the blood cell, which is the white blood cell neutrophil and the red blood cell. For the nerve tissue, there are 3 examples of neuron: afferent neuron, interneuron, and the efferent neuron. Let's look into detail for the epithelial tissue. The main function is cover the body surface of organ cavities and tooth. Epithelial tissue can be found in skin, alveoli, lining of small intestine, and the trachea. Skin cover our body outer surface and form also protective barrier which against the entry of pathogens. And for the alveoli, the epithelial tissue is thin, flattened, and arranged in single layer to allow the exchange of gases. Epithelial tissue also form the lining of small intestine, which cover the inner surface of the small intestine and form the villus, and also undergo specialization to become the goblet cell, which can secrete the mucus. Epithelial cells that form the lining of trachea have hair-like projection called cilia. Here is the diagram of the cilia. And this cilia can sweep the impurities away from the lung. And this lining of cell also contains the goblet cell to secrete the mucus, and it can trap the dust. The diagram here shows different epithelial tissue which have different shape and different function, but all of it cover either inner surface or outer surface. 3 different types of muscle tissue: smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and all these muscles can contract and relax so that it can move the body or part of the body. Please identify these 3 different muscle cells. We can find smooth muscle tissue in intestine, blood vessel, urinary and reproductive tract. This smooth muscle tissue will go into contract and relax, and causing the pre-digestive movement of the digestive tract. And this type of movement is involuntary because we cannot control it. Skeletal muscle can be found in our arms, legs, and it contracts and relaxes to move the bones, and it connects the bone through the tendon. This type of movement is voluntary because we can control this movement. And actually, the example of the skeletal muscle, like the chicken wings, drumstick. So when you are eating the chicken wings and the drumstick, you are eating the skeletal muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle build up the walls of the heart. It contracts to pump the blood, and this type of movement is involuntary. Do you know why we call smooth muscle tissue smooth? Think about it. Another diagram to help you to identify skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Connective tissue. Actually, the name already tells you the function, connect. So the function is to bind, to connect, and support other tissue. Loose connective tissue. It binds the skin or the epithelium to the underlying tissue, and it also helps to hold the organ in place. Fibrous connective tissue is the collagenous fiber and can form in tendon and ligament. Other examples of connective tissue like cartilage, bone, blood tissue, adipose tissue. And another animal tissue, nerve tissue. It consists of nerve cell which called neuron, and it can transmit the nerve impulse. Another diagram again to help you to identify the different types of connective tissue. Loose connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, blood, adipose tissue, and the bone tissue. We can learn a lot from dissecting a frog. For example, here we can see that the epithelial tissue, it binds to the underlying tissue, is connected by the loose connective tissue. The diagram shown here is cutting the loose connective tissue so that we can pull away the skin. And when you cut it inside, you can see that the organs like the heart, small intestine, large intestine, all are held in place by the loose connective tissue also. Fibrous connective tissue like the tendons, so it helps to connect the muscle tissue, the skeletal muscle tissue here, connect to the bones. And another example of the connective tissue here is the cartilage. Now we go for the two different types of plant tissue. So besides memorizing the two different types of plant tissue, we should be able to look into the example of the tissue and the specialized cell. There are two different types of meristematic tissue, apical meristem and lateral meristem. And these meristematic tissue are able to divide by mitosis. This is the example of the meristematic cell. So you can look at the cell, the nucleus look very big, and there's no vacuum because this cell is just undergo cell division. So cell is still small, so that's why the nucleus look big. Three different types of permanent tissue: epidermal tissue, ground tissue, vascular tissue. Epidermal tissue is for cover the surface. So the example here, you can see that upper epidermis, lower epidermis, which cover the surface, is the epidermal tissue. And the cell also undergoes specialization to form the gut cell. Vascular tissue is for transport. For example, xylem tissue. And the example here in the diagram here, this is the xylem tissue for transport water and mineral salt. And here is one example of the cell in xylem tissue, and this is xylem versa. And for the phloem tissue, it is for transporting the organic substances. Look at the diagram here. For covering the surface is epidermal tissue. For the transport is the ground tissue, and the other space all filled by the ground tissue. So ground tissue, there are three examples: parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma tissue. And here, submesophile, spongy mesophile is the example of parenchyma tissue that undergo specialization. And this polysubmesophile, spongy mesophile contain a lot of chloroplasts for carry out the photosynthesis. Now we look into detail again for the meristematic tissue, which is apical meristem. And this apical meristem can found in rooted and shooted. And this is the cell. And please remember the characteristic of the meristematic cell: small, thin cell wall, and the nucleus look big, so large nuclei, dense cytoplasm, that means a lot of organelle inside there, but there is no vacuole because the cell just divides through mitosis and the cell is still small and no vacuole. And remember, the function of the meristematic tissue is mitosis. Meristematic cell will undergo cell division, which is mitosis, 1 divided into 2, 2 divided into 4, and repeat again and again to produce many cells. And some of these cells will undergo differentiation to become epidermal tissue, which cover the surface. And it will become vascular tissue, like the xylem for transporting water and minerals, which color red here. And for the phloem tissue, which transport the organic substances like the sucrose, which is color blue here. And for the ground tissue, which fill the space between the dermal and vascular tissue systems. So all here, which I color yellow, here is the ground tissue. For the root, the cross section of the root, we also can find the epidermal tissue covering the surface, xylem, phloem, vascular tissue for transport, and the ground tissue for filling the space between the epidermal and vascular tissue. Parenchyma tissue, one example of the ground tissue. It is the most unspecialized cell, and it acts as a packing tissue because it fills the space between the epidermal and the vascular tissue. And please look at the diagram here. You can find that the cell wall is still thin. And for the collenchyma tissue, you can see that the corner of the cell wall is thick. That is the deposition of the extracellulose at the corner of the cell. Example of the sclerenchyma tissue like fiber and sclerate. And fiber is for support and strengthen the plants due to lignified walls. And this is the transverse section of the fiber, and here is the longitudinal section of the fiber. And what you can see here is the cell wall is very thick. And another example of sclerenchyma tissue here is the sclerate. This is the diagram for the sclerate for convert the firmness or rigidity where they occur. And we can find it in the flesh or the peel. Then this is why when we're eating the peel, we will find the grittiness. It is because of the sclerates. 2.4 Level of organization in multicellular organism. So of course, start with the cell. That is the basis of life. Cell become more specialized to carry out particular tasks. Cell, only one. And a group of cells, then we call it tissue. So this is the tissue, and which are similar in structure and perform a specific function. Organs, so different type of tissue were going to work together to form an organ and carry out a function. And the systems is the several organs which organize into our systems. And finally, different systems will make up the organism. The diagram shown here is the digestive systems, which make up of different organs, and the organs shown here is the stomach. And let's look into detail the wall of the stomach. It is made up of epithelial tissue, loose connective tissue, and a smooth muscle tissue. So that's why we say different type of tissue will make up an organ. Please find out the 11 different organ systems here and read through the main components and the functions. The plant system is divided into shoot system and root system. Please read through to understand it. That's all for the lesson 2.3 and 2.4. Goodbye.